HIV/AIDS. Nearly 37 million people are living with HIV and AIDS. Human immune deficiency virus is HIV, which is a disease that attacks an individual's immune system. Your immune system is what helps fight off bacteria and disease inside your body. The virus kills a type of white blood cell called CD4 cells and then copies itself inside that cell. As this process repeats itself, it gradually attacks your immune system so it can no longer fight off other bacteria and diseases. The virus is referred to AIDS when HIV is in its final stage and is no longer able to protect your body against other bacteria and diseases. When the infection is this advanced and untreated, this is what leads to death. Well, many people who are diagnosed with HIV live in regions of the world where they don't have access to treatment. About 2/3 of the world's population suffering from HIV live in Africa, and 1 in every 25 adults are actually living with HIV. So again, if there's a treatment, what's the issue now? I want to repeat it again, that although there is a treatment, so many folks in regions around the world aren't able to access that treatment. In addition to those without access to treatment, the next piece is lack of education, which is causing the spread of HIV and AIDS as well. In the United States and in Canada, we're well aware of sexually transmitted diseases. As well, we know and have been taught that it's not okay to share needles. But this type of education is lacking in other parts of the world and is what's causing the spread of HIV and AIDS, and people are finding out after it's too late. So how did this happen? Let's talk about the history. Many people believe that the origin of HIV and AIDS came from the Democratic Republic of Congo in the 1920s. It's believed that the infection crossed from chimpanzees to humans, but didn't become an epidemic until the 1970s. Now, in the early 1980s, HIV was primarily found in gay men, and it was believed that this disease was only spread through sexual transmission, which they initially called this disease GRID, which is gay-related immune deficiency. Now, researchers quickly learned that this disease didn't just affect gay men, but it affected everyone. But people didn't really believe this until 1991 when basketball star Magic Johnson announced that he was also HIV positive, and he was a heterosexual man. In 2015, Charlie Sheen announced to the world on the Today Show that he was HIV positive as well. Since Charlie Sheen announced to the world, he's been speaking out about treatment, about what it's like to live with HIV, and helping to break the stigma. So my first interaction with HIV and AIDS came actually when I was a kid. As you guys might know, I don't have any legs, and when you have a surgery like that, you receive blood transfusion, because obviously I lost a lot of blood. And I had to go in for an HIV and AIDS test a few years later because I was on the cusp where people were donating blood before many people were getting tested. And so sometimes they had infected blood that they were giving people during blood transfusions. I did not receive that, but that was definitely a concern. And for me, that was the first time I experienced and started to understand the basics of what HIV and AIDS was. As a kid, I didn't really comprehend, but I knew that I could get sick through blood. To give us a bit more information, I want to talk to an expert and someone who's done a lot of work with HIV and AIDS. All right, so folks, we are here with Dr. Shelley White. Shelley, tell us who you are, and let's start there. Who are you and what do you do?
Thank you. Well, I'm super excited to be joining you. I teach at a university called Simmons University, and I run a Master of Public Health program in health equity. So basically what we focus on are the intersections of health and social justice. And I'm also really proudly a board member of We Charity.
And for those of you that have watched the hunger video, which Jake will put in a little link, Dr. Jonathan White is Shelley's partner.
Indeed, yeah. We've both been a part of this journey with We together for almost 20 years, and it's been awesome to be as partners in this work.
They're also my best friends and mentors. So, now that we've said all those formal things, today's video we're talking about HIV and AIDS, and I couldn't think of anybody better to talk to give us a little bit more information about this topic. So, can you give us a bit of your journey on how you sort of came to be an activist for HIV and AIDS, if is that what you would call yourself?
I think I would at this point. I guess I'm just a part of the movement, which has been a long time movement. So for folks who may not know, HIV was first discovered in 1981, but I was in elementary school, so I didn't know much about it. But nonetheless, growing up, like many people, I probably had many of the stigmas that people have about this disease, like that you could get it from like holding hands with someone or from kissing someone or sharing a drink. And so I think it was something that stoked a lot of fear when I was young. And then in college, I became an HIV/AIDS educator, and I learned a lot more about it myself. Learned, for instance, that it can only be transmitted in 4 really specific ways, and that also it's very much preventable. And then after I studied my master's of public health myself, I had the opportunity to work in southern Africa in a country called Lesotho. And Lesotho, unfortunately, has the 3rd highest rates of HIV in the world.
Can you talk just very briefly about, because I know this, and I know you know this, but the folks watching may not understand, this is a completely preventable disease, but it didn't start out that way publicly. Can you give us like a little bit of that background?
Please, I'm so glad you asked, Spence, because really anytime I give a public talk about HIV, and especially as we're looking at World AIDS Day, I hate to think that I've been giving speeches about HIV for so many, really for a couple decades on this day that we're looking ahead to. But that's, I think, a misconception that people feel is that like HIV isn't something we can prevent, and it absolutely is. Mm-hmm. So HIV is only transmitted in 4 really specific ways. Mm-hmm. So the primary way is through sexual transmission, mm-hmm. and sometimes people think this is a disease of folks who are gay, and that's not the case. It's mm-hmm. primarily transmitted through heterosexual sex. And then the second way is through injection drug use or different paraphernalia that's used in those ways. The third way is from mother to baby, which can happen during birth or during pregnancy. And then lastly, through blood-to-blood contact. And so that sounds like a lot of ways, but they're really specific, and actually every single one is preventable. Mm-hmm. And the amazing thing about the history of this epidemic is that we've had every tool we needed to prevent really the vast majority, maybe 100% of infections since the 1980s, early 1990s. So we have the tools, and the sad part of the story is that we've long had the tools. We just haven't necessarily had the political will to care. And so I think the history of HIV/AIDS is very much a story of asking ourselves, like, whose lives matter in the world? Mm-hmm. And I don't like the answers when I ask that question.
Yeah. Oof, that's a tough one. So with sort of your work and what you're seeing now, I felt like when I was growing up, we heard a lot of like the AIDS epidemic, the AIDS epidemic, the AIDS epidemic. And maybe it's because I'm older and I don't know, so I'm anxious to hear your thoughts on this. I feel like I don't hear it as much anymore being called an epidemic, or I don't hear as much about it as I did when I was growing up in school. And is that something that you experienced, and do you know why, or am I just totally off base there?
Yeah, well, here's the interesting thing is that in the US and in Canada, there was a time when there was so much heightened fear about HIV, and that was especially in the 80s mm-hmm. and in the 90s, and you probably remember that too, as I do, although I'm older than you, Sven, so I'll go ahead and admit that.
But not by very much. Not by very much.
But, so the thing is that when we were fearful and we didn't understand this disease, mm-hmm. There was a lot more messaging about it. You could see posters and billboards. In fact, in the 1980s, there was this campaign in the 90s where there were these big billboards, like in the middle of Times Square, New York, that would say, AIDS doesn't discriminate. Right, and the message was that anybody can get HIV, mm-hmm. And HIV is that virus that causes AIDS. Mm-hmm. AIDS complications are what folks pass away from, but that can be a very long progression. But early in the epidemic, it was much shorter. So on average, if people aren't treated, they'll live about 5 to 7 years. Luckily, in the 1990s in the US and in Canada, we rolled out optimal treatment, like a combination of treatments mm-hmm. that meant that life expectancies actually doubled almost immediately, like within 2 years, and death rates fell by 70% within 5 years. That's an amazing outcome of that technology. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, we're still in the middle of an epidemic. It's just that epidemic has largely flourished in what we call the global south, countries that don't have the same level of economic or political advantage as we have. And again, a lot of the reasons behind that go back to colonial histories and these sort of political inequalities in our world. But just to put some numbers to it, mm-hmm. we've already lost 35 million people to AIDS, 35 million human lives, and Jeez. Today, 37 million people are still infected. It just might not be visible to us. Mm-hmm. And so it's almost like the world has sort of forgotten as we rolled out adequate treatment in our countries, but it's something we can't forget. Every single year, 2 million people are newly infected, and over 1 million people die. And every single day, like today, nearly 6,000 people will become newly infected with a preventable virus, and we'll lose about 3,000 people to AIDS. So it's unacceptable, and it's still very much at epidemic levels.
Jeez, oh my gosh. So, I mean, I feel like we hear a lot about prevention in North America, and is the education piece what is, how do I want to say this, creating a barrier for other places outside of North America, which is contributing to these large numbers?
Definitely, because sexual transmission is the number one mode of transmission, and then followed by injection drug use.
Mm-hmm.
The ways that you prevent is through education, letting people know how they can prevent transmission, which is really about safe sexual practices, knowing your partner, having good communication, and being empowered in your relationships, right? And so it also comes back to things like gender equity and sexual justice. And so, I think that unfortunately these are also topics that are really stigmatized. In other words, we tend to push them under the rug or feel uncomfortable when we're talking about things like sexual education or HIV for that matter. And so because of that, I think sometimes we don't give it the attention that it needs. And when it comes to education, unfortunately, it's sort of become fairly political about how we educate young people, and frankly, how we educate all people about how they can take care of themselves and their bodies.
So from your perspective, like, what can we do better as a global community to start potentially lowering these numbers so they're not continually climbing?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. In the global response, the Global Fund is one of the leading organizations that tried to bring together countries in a huge international response to HIV/AIDS.
Okay. So with World AIDS Day coming up on December 1st, why is it important, and what are some things that we should be doing or paying attention to, or on that day specifically?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I feel is really important for us to raise our voices on is actually the price of HIV drugs. Folks may not know this, but in the United States, it costs between $10,000 and $12,000 per patient per year to treat HIV.
Whoa.
That's unnecessary.
Yeah.
It's not that the drugs are so expensive, it's that there are these things called patents. Patents are basically what ensure that the company that's selling the drug can require a high profit from selling them. And then, of course, to ask our governments to sort of depoliticize education, sexual education. We should provide folks with comprehensive education so they know exactly what they need to do to prevent an infection, and also ensure that folks are empowered with the resources to be able to do that.
That's awesome. So what's one thing that you're going to do on World AIDS Day?
Well, I will also be raising my voice. I like to follow, for instance, what's happening through UN AIDS in terms of key actions. Another great resource is Avert, avert.org. And then I also get involved in activism through a group called the Center for Policy Analysis on Trade and Health, which is kind of a mouthful, but it's cpac.org. And they do some great work on this issue of patents. So those are the groups that I'll be working with in terms of raising my voice about especially that issue of drug pricing, to ensure that we can really value people's lives when they are living with HIV, and that they're not forgotten, because again, the history of this epidemic has really been a history of forgetting that every life matters, and particularly those in the global south. And it's really racialized too, and so it's important to really highlight those intersections of like histories of racism and HIV.
Wow. So is there like one final thought or one thing that you wish people always knew but they don't, or is there one thing that you're like, if everyone knew this one thing and did this one thing? And maybe it's not a one thing, but like just as like a final thought,
Yeah, how much time do you have? Remember that HIV is 100% preventable. And therefore, if it's not being prevented and we're still seeing 37 million people infected with this disease 3 decades plus into this epidemic, we have to ask ourselves what's gone wrong? Who are we forgetting? And how can we do better? And that means we got to raise our voices. We have to be a part of this movement and ask better of ourselves and of our countries, of our leaders.
Awesome. Shelley, thank you so much for what you do with your voice and your platform and sharing your knowledge with us. We really appreciate it. So what can we do? The first thing, today, December 1st, is World AIDS Day. So you can go get a red ribbon, which I'm going to do later today, and wear that proudly. And that is to show support for folks living with HIV and AIDS, and also AIDS and HIV research. You can also donate to the National AIDS Trust, which actually sponsors World AIDS Day. The money donated will go towards helping people with prevention, treatment, and also education. Now, when you get your red ribbon, I challenge you to post it on social media with the hashtag #RockTheRibbon to show folks living with HIV and AIDS that you stand in solidarity with them and you support them, also to break down the stigma and discrimination. The last thing that you can do is to understand prevention and education and how that's taught in your community. And if you're not happy with how that is, do your part to affect change. Maybe that's calling your local congressperson or also calling your local person in Parliament. Remember, this is a 100% preventable disease.